Great. Welcome to our afternoon session in the 2012 Urban Forums. We are concentrating in our third session on spatial and network mechanisms, and Chris Browning will be leading us off with a paper entitled Advancing the Conceptualization and Measurement of Neighborhood Context, Integrating Social Network and Activity Space Approaches. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks. So I'd like to thank the conference organizers, among them my co-author Kate Cagney. Actually, a slightly different title here. Before the conference, I actually had a chance to look at an early version of the program. And of course, I looked at everything but my own paper title. So it's completely my fault that this has not been updated. So what I'd like to do is actually kind of a hybrid talk where I review some of the challenges and future directions associated with the field. And what I'd like to do is talk about how activity, space, and network approaches can be usefully applied to addressing some of these challenges. And I'd like to actually walk you through an analysis. We haven't had much of that today, but I'm going to briefly attempt to do so, not dwelling too much on the detail, just to give you a sense of how we might use data on people's routine activity spaces, geographically identified data, to help add texture and nuance to research on neighborhood context. Then I'm going to review some recent data collection projects that are currently underway or under submission, and talk about how some of those efforts are going to hopefully help us deal with some of the challenges facing the literature. So first thing I do is like to cite one of my co-presenters, David Harding here, who argues that neighborhood research desperately needs new and far more nuanced data. In particular, we need data that measure how individuals and families of different types allocate their time between different places, the extent of exposure to different people and locations, as well as their consequent influences on individual behavior. So we agree completely, and also commiserate on the desperation. We have some amazing data sources, and unfortunately we've been working with them for a while, and we have not had an opportunity to integrate some of the new technologies for collecting much more specific spatial data into these large-scale data collection efforts. So activity space data, I think, can help us address this need in part. And so again, what I mean by that simply is just information on the places people go on a daily basis with some regularity. So our theories, I would argue, fundamentally involve exposure as a mechanism. Not all theories of neighborhood effects do. You can have theories that involve, say, reputational effects of a particular area on social psychological outcomes or health outcomes without direct exposure. You might have a mediation model where the influence of a neighborhood on a young child, for instance, is entirely through a parent or an immediate social network. For the most part, I would argue, our theories involve exposure. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us to actually understand, theorize that exposure, and incorporate data on it in our research. I also think this would allow us to get a little bit further down the road on the causality and selection issue. It's no panacea, but certainly if we have data on exposures to a potential treatment, we can make stronger claims about the effects of that particular treatment. So particularly in the case where you have, say, a quasi-exogenous introduction of some institution or change to a neighborhood, and we assume that that change will exert influence through exposure, we can actually capture that if we have activity space data on the residents of that neighborhood. I think these data also have implications for measurement. We have an ongoing problem of trying to understand what a neighborhood is. So is a census tract appropriate? Is a census block group aggregation of census units? And there's much back and forth on this. I think that we ultimately can't make any strong claims about the utility of any unit without understanding actual patterns of space use. And then finally, I think Rob made reference to this earlier, we have a tendency to do siloed research generally, and that applies to contextual research as well. So we have neighborhood research, we have school context research, and so on. With activity-based data, we are making incorporating, by definition, multiple contexts into our research design. So we at least have the opportunity to know what those spatial and social exposures are. So what I'm going to do is talk about, to begin with, a specific analysis. This is some ongoing work with data from the Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Study, which is really one of the only large-scale social surveys with a neighborhood focus that incorporates any activity space of any kind of richness. So I'm going to spell out some of the theoretical models of neighborhood social organization. So how do we understand the origins of collective efficacy would be broadly the question, and bring in some work of Jane Jacobs that I think has an interesting ecological model of the origins of social interaction, trust, and norms of intervention on behalf of neighborhood goals. And then see how we might try to use activity space to get at testing these models. So Rob has already given us an introduction to this model. I'll just briefly walk through it. This collective efficacy approach, I think, has been enormously fruitful and has demonstrated relevance for a wide variety of outcomes beyond crime, certainly health, and some of the work that Kate and I and others have done. And the basic idea is that neighborhood structural disadvantage captured principally by economic disadvantage, poverty, residential instability, and racial and ethnic composition diminish the likelihood of local social network ties of various kinds, and also participation in local voluntary organizations. This kind of social infrastructure effect then has implications for the level of trust and norms of intervention on behalf of local objectives. And that in turn has a wide variety of potential influences, crime and health being central to many of the analyses we've seen. So I'm going to argue that Jane Jacobs actually has an interesting spin on this, that this is in some ways an early version of a collective efficacy model. She has a slightly different set of structural influences that she focuses on, principally the combination of population or residential density and commercial or organizational, institutional density within a community. Places to go, essentially. So when you have a lot of people and places they're interested in going to within a neighborhood, that will generate spatially, temporally distributed street activity. And this street activity, if you go to the top here, this in turn leads to street monitoring or eyes on the street. Many of us who have any familiarity with Jane Jacobs at all tend to associate the Jane Jacobs model with this notion of eyes on the street as an effective deterrent to crime. I would also argue that she has another component to this model, and that is that street activity will lead to public contact, overlapping public routines, and interaction in public space, not necessarily network ties, but regularized interaction that results in familiarity and then a sense of trust, and in turn, a willingness to intervene on behalf of the public good. So ongoing casual public interaction, often associated with errand running, brokered by businesses, organizations, leads to familiarity and then ultimately trust, combined with, in her words, an assumption of general street support when the chips are down, which I would argue could be easily fit into the collective efficacy framework. So what we're interested in here is specifically this link between overlapping routines, public routines, conventional routine activity, and the likelihood of greater social organization in the form of trust and neighborhood-based interactions and ultimately norms of intervention on behalf of the public good. So how do we operationalize this? Well, we can do this to some extent with activity space data. I'm going to try to make an argument that we can do it in at least a very basic form with the Los Angeles data. So we define a couple of different concepts that are important. A routine activity network would be the extent to which residents of a neighborhood intersect in space while engaging in daily conventional activities. And here it's space broadly operationalized. Do people show up at all in a generally defined area? Is there interactional potential in the routine activities associated with this group of residents? So then we can think about, once we think about that as a network, and Rob has done some really interesting work thinking about residential mobility networks, in this case it's a routine activity network, we can then use social network methods to characterize that network and operationalize some of the features of a network that we think might be related to social organizational outcomes. So in particular, what we focus on here is centralization. Are there particularly popular places that a lot of people go? A central business district in a neighborhood, perhaps a school, that tends to draw a lot of people and lead to a greater likelihood of familiarity. Clustering would be another one, and I'll get into the operationalization more specifically in a moment, but it's just more generally the extent of overlap and interconnection among residents and activity locations throughout a network. So then our question is, do these characteristics of what you might call ecological community, do residents of neighborhoods with higher levels of ecological community report richer social organization? That is, more interaction with neighbors, more recognition of neighbors, collective efficacy, and then in turn, consistent with the Jacobs model, would they perceive their neighborhoods to be less dangerous? So again, I'll walk through these pretty quickly. This is data from, again, Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Study, and we use wave one, it's cross-sectional data. It's a sample of 65 census tracts within LA County and about 2,500 adults. So what we do is define an overlapping routine activity space, a network, based on reports of XY coordinates, addresses essentially, from respondents about where they work, where their children go to school, religious services, grocery shopping, healthcare, parents' home, an alternative child residence if there's a non-resident parent. These are a subset, of course, of all routine activities, but we think that they're a reasonable subset to give us a picture of the spaces people tend to encounter. So we aggregate these locations to the household level. Again, XY coordinates, we maintain coordinates only within the state of California. And we get about 5 activities reported per household and 4.2 unique non-home locations, that is, block groups that people go to, okay? So we're defining co-location here by census block group. So this is a relatively large unit, but again, it's getting at this interactional potential that in the aggregate we think might have implications for social organization. And again, this is a fundamental condition, right? So you can imagine a community where people don't share routine activities. There's no overlap in space. There's minimal basis upon which for public social solidarity to emerge. Okay, so we have about 40.2 households per network, 81 unique block groups, group locations, and then 160 household block group ties. So I won't go into these measures in depth, but we use network measures. This is a 2-mode network, meaning we have actors tied through a location, a routine activity location. And we use network measures of centralization, again, popular places, and then a measure of clustering in a 2-mode network. And that's essentially if I share 2 distinct activity locations with 2 distinct neighbors, what's the probability that they share a 3rd distinct location? And that helps get at as that probability goes up, I benefit from their increased familiarity, essentially. So it's a bit of it's an attempt to get at overlapping routine activities that moves away from the centralization operationalization. Okay, so this is just pictures of a co-location network from an LA fan census tract, just to show you that we can indeed generate one. We can see that this is a more highly centralized co-location network. You can see that a little bit more easily than the clustering. And we have a variety of dependent measures, number of adults you recognize, people you talk to, or describe that as an individual level social capital measure, network exchange, intergenerational closure, the extent to which parents know children, and parents know each other as well. And then a measure of collective efficacy, which builds on the Sampson measure. Are neighbors close-knit, helpful, trustworthy, and would they intervene if kids were hanging out, spray painting, graffiti, et cetera? And then a measure of neighborhood safety. So I'll just go straight to the results. Essentially what we get here is fairly consistent positive effects of clustering within the routine activity network on all of these outcomes, and then centralization for intergenerational closure and collective efficacy. So we do find some evidence, and these are in models with a whole range of controls, which I'm happy to talk about if anyone is curious. So also a negative effect on perceptions of danger, again, of clustering, suggesting that these routine activity networks characterized by these network dimensions may have implications not only for social organization, but perceptions of fear. So, of course, this analysis is not ideal. We find some evidence, but we have a variety of limitations. This is cross-sectional co-location measured at a relatively high level of aggregation. And here again, we're using census boundaries. We're limited by census boundaries, and we have a limited number of activities and locations. So what we've been doing is trying to think about how this approach could be applied to a variety of outcomes, one of which would be adolescent risk behavior. David reported on some of the neighborhood cultural research on adolescent outcomes. Here we're interested in how a co-location network might actually be useful in understanding adolescents' exposures and the pattern, the clustering of locations in which they might be embedded. So the first question we wanted to know was, can we measure these co-location networks with more precise personal activity space data? So we have a pilot in Franklin County where Ohio State is located, 63 youth from a high-income and a low-income community. And we just asked them to report on regularly scheduled or programmed activities, things they regularly do, and then any other places they went in the last week. And then we used a Google Maps interface to generate this location data. So we said, all right, if kid might report, yeah, I went to McDonald's in High Street after school a few days, and said, well, tell me where that McDonald's is. And then you call up, do a Google search, and it'll produce a set of options. And then once you got the right one, then you fill the address fields, and that gives you an exact XY coordinate that can be linked and create a tie with another sampled kid who also happens to say that he spends time at McDonald's on High Street. And we got these addresses for 92% of the kids. So we produced this precise address-based co-location network for kids from, in this instance, the low-income community. And as you can see, it's people are typically linked through schools, organizations, community center, library, and so on. We had actually about 11 different schools in this low-income network. In contrast, we had 5 schools reported for a larger sample for the high-income community. But you can see here, if you think about, so the circles being individuals, the squares activity locations, there are just a lot more activities for the high-income kids. And these networks, even with just 4 or 5 locations, vary in ways that you would expect. So this has led to a larger study that has been funded by NIDA and WT Grant Foundation. We're going to be collecting data on the whole county for about 4,000 kids, interviewing at baseline kids 11 to 17 and caregivers, and then giving them smartphones equipped with GPS for a week. So we'll have much more precise information on a travel path over the course of a week. And we'll be texting them questions 4 or 5 times a day on who they're with, what they're doing, where they're at, mood, behavior, and so on, to get spatially referenced information on behavior, mood, et cetera, that then can give us some much more precise information on how spatial exposures are working. So we'll have then a follow-up interview where we download that travel path over the course of the week and then ask the kid questions about where they've been and yeah, not the very specific behaviors, risk behaviors, you know, so you were smoking pot here, I see. So yeah, more of a data cleaning exercise, but we'll also have a separate phone-based community survey, which will then allow us to characterize the areas in which these kids are experiencing daily exposures, and a school survey as well. So this will then allow us to construct communities. So we'll generate one big co-location network for the entire county, and then use some network methods developed in part by, full disclosure, our discussant, who's also part of this group. So, yeah, I know, it's out. Then these techniques will allow us then to come up with patterned communities, what we're calling them communities, routine activity communities, where kids are more likely to show up than not. And then that'll get us beyond or in addition to an immediate residential environment and associated effects. So we also have a study in the works right now that will attempt to apply some of this thinking to older adults. And Kate is taking the lead on this in an attempt to understand how exposures of older adults may vary. We make the assumption that the radius of routine activity decreases with age. We don't actually know that with any empirical certainty, and we don't know how it varies by characteristics of older adults. So this is a further extension of some of this work. So I will actually leave it there, because I think I'm over. So thanks.
Our next presenter is Louise Hawkley from the University of Chicago, and she'll speak on loneliness and life satisfaction in the United States, a state-level analysis. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you. Okay, for a completely different pace, we've gone from very micro, what I think of as micro with the neighborhoods, to a broader level, and I do this with some trepidation. I'm a psychologist, and it's ironic to me that I, who've been studying individuals, am now making this leap and looking at state-level variation. I hope the sense of that will come through as I proceed. I'm going to leap right into what we're actually looking at and why. Life satisfaction. Some of you will probably be aware of how much coverage there is in the news these days internationally on well-being, and life satisfaction being one component of well-being. And what does it mean for a country or a state or a city to be high or low in well-being? There are definitions that I've provided here. There's a cognitive component that we typically think of as evaluation of life, and that's what we will be looking at here. But there's also affective components, just looking at how happy you are, mood-based effects. There's evidence of clustering. You see it at the network level. This is Fowler and Christakis' work, but you also see it at the country level and at a county level, pardon me, and at the national level. Within the United States, this is Renfro and et al.'s paper from 2009. And you can see differences there in the well-being by the intensity of the color. So the dark end here is very happy. You see Utah is sticking out like crazy. We've got Minnesota and Washington looking pretty good. Some nice pockets on the East Coast, and really low levels, I guess, generally through this Appalachian area into the south. Some fine-tuned discriminations one could make there. But in any event, when they looked at what was associated with well-being, this is the kind of thing they isolated. They didn't have a lot of variables they were looking at, but the states who had better well-being were wealthier, had higher income levels, median housing value was greater, higher levels of education, and greater degree of inclusiveness. Let's switch gears. Loneliness. And I want to define that because this isn't loneliness as is commonly understood. We're not talking about being alone. We're talking about the perception of isolation, which can be totally independent of your objective state. You can be alone and not feel lonely. You can be with other people and feel lonely. And that's the perception that we're interested in here, formally defined as a discrepancy between your desired and actual relationships. It's typically more closely related to the quality than the quantity of your relationships, and it can be distinguishable from other psychological characteristics that it's typically confused with, like depression, stress, social support. Critical point here is the last one. We've increasingly come to think of these feelings of isolation as being beyond people's control. You typically won't feel isolated if you feel you have a choice. If you feel you could choose another place to be or another context, psychological context that would make you feel comfortable. So if it's not your choice, then it's going to be a particularly toxic, potentially chronic state of isolation. We see there's clustering in that too, and taking the Fowler and Christakis approach. The blue circles here are the loneliest people, green and yellow less so, and the point to take from this network picture is just that loneliness clusters are peripheralized. So in essence, in the psychological terms, people who are lonely are essentially quarantined. They are contagious, get them out of here. And they end up clustering at the outside edges. Why might that happen? I'm drawing here from Renfro, Gosling, and Potter, a theoretical paper. When they talk about persistence of clustering, there's a number of explanations they offer: selective migration, social influence, psychological, we've already talked about contagion, sociological, environmental factors that could contribute to this clustering or regional differences. Why does it matter? Health is a big thing for us. We've been looking at why it is that people who are isolated or feel isolated die sooner, develop more chronic conditions, become worse in their chronic conditions. For example, we've looked at blood pressure over a 5-year period. Why is it that people who perceive themselves to be isolated, and we're talking about an older population here, 50 to 67, they show increase, everybody shows an increase in blood pressure over that time period, but those who are isolated show a faster rate of increase. So in a number of ways, loneliness is putting people on a trajectory for worse health and increased mortality. Life satisfaction, same kind of data has already been put out there. Economic factors, this is where my interest in the state level has begun. It's definitely not going to stop there, but we want to establish a phenomenon. Is there even this kind of regional variation? Why? Because there are countries who are very actively looking for ways to improve national or local levels of well-being or isolation. The country of Denmark has a national policy now. They are going to abolish social isolation. So how are they going to do that? We don't know, but they want to do it. And so there's a need to start thinking about this in many different contexts. How does that map out? How are you going to get from A to B? For our purposes, we're looking at a data set here, the Health and Retirement Study. They started administering a 3-item version of the loneliness questionnaire back in 2004 to just a subset. We're starting in 2006 and 2008. Half the wave got the life satisfaction and the loneliness questionnaire in each wave in the leave behind module. So over a 2-wave period, we've got about 14,000 people. Mean age there is about 68. You can see there the kind of questions that people are asked. And we know at what level we can expect to see variance. Individuals nested in households, in zip codes, in counties. We've added in metropolitan, the MSAs, and then states. And states is 47 because of the data that we have available. Some states do not have sufficient data. This is a sort of a small version of it. I'll show you another one in a moment. So percent of variation at each level, individual variation sucks up a huge proportion of the variance in both loneliness, which is in blue, and life satisfaction, which is in yellow, about 60+% in both cases. Households, another 33 to 37%. And then 1.27, 1.62, I'll blow this up a little bit. From zip code on down, you can see that at the state level where we're going to be focusing is really a very small proportion of the total variance. Doesn't mean that state doesn't make a difference. We'll have to figure out how it might make a difference. All the intervening levels and steps and mechanisms, that's where I'm going to be asking you the questions. So here's a map of what we've seen in loneliness distributed across the US in the top plot. Dark areas above average loneliness. So we've got 4 categories: below average, more than 1 standard deviation below average, within a standard deviation below average, within 1 standard deviation above average, and more than 1 standard deviation above average. Idaho is really not feeling lonely at all. And then there's variations here where the most pronounced are, I'm a Canadian and I'm blanking on this state. Wyoming? What's that state? Montana, that's it. Okay, and then the same, if one of the things we wanted to make a point of here is loneliness and life satisfaction are quite correlated at the individual level. And they are at the state level too. I should have had that slide first. But what we want to see here is a map that overlays pretty nicely if they're that closely related. And you do see some, but there are some inconsistencies as well. And what's accounting for that? If I rank order the states in loneliness, these are the top 10 in loneliness. Most lonely, Delaware, DC, Montana, Utah, and so on, down to Wyoming, which should correspond to the bottom 10 in life satisfaction. And there are some overlaps there too. DC appears in both, Montana in both, and so on, Delaware. If I do the same thing the other direction, Idaho, as we saw, was not at all lonely. Maine, Kansas, Oregon, Minnesota, and so on. You get some overlap there too. You see Minnesota here as well. But look at this. You see Utah and South Dakota. I should backtrack because I don't think I highlighted that in the previous one. See how Utah is on the top 10 list in loneliness? Oops. It's in the bottom or top 10 in life satisfaction. So it's completely flip. Don't have an explanation for that yet, but you might have ideas.
How loneliness was defined in the survey?
By those questions that I was showing a few slides ago. So they're asked how isolated they feel, whether they feel left out, whether they lack companionship. And that's all on response scales that range from 0 to 2, and that's summed, and so they could range anywhere from 0 to 6. So here's the actual plot of loneliness against life satisfaction. And you do see a nice correlation, minus 0.757. In this same sample at the individual level, it's minus 0.39. But you can see this is Utah on the high end of loneliness, but also in the high quadrant for life satisfaction. So we went, at this point, directly to just correlations. What exactly is happening here? Can we see some coarse level associations between state level characteristics and the kinds of loneliness and life satisfaction levels we're seeing? And you do see, for example, percent married. The greater the percent married in that state, the less lonely these people are. These people are older people, and the percent married refers to all adults in that state. So you'd expect that. In general, marriage is considered protective for loneliness. You're married, you're going to be less lonely. We adjust for life satisfaction to see if there's something unique we learn or some unique associations for those two outcomes, and you still see the married effect. The same is not true for life satisfaction. You get a non-significant positive effect for life satisfaction, but it completely drops out when you account for loneliness. Certainly consistent with on the individual level where the satisfaction you get out of your marriage or whether or not it's protective is not whether you have the spouse, it's whether that marriage quality is of high quality. Some other things to highlight, the percent living alone. The more there are living alone in your state, the lonelier you are. We have to think about why that is. How are people experiencing that state that they themselves are feeling lonelier, even independent of whether they're living alone. Got some of these in visual form. It highlights a few things about the data. So the percent married, there's an inverse association, but this is DC. So there's a very low marriage rate relative to the other states, and this very high loneliness level. DC is also hanging out here, but more in the cluster with life satisfaction. Percent living alone, again, positive for loneliness, negative for life satisfaction, kind of what you'd expect given how loneliness and life satisfaction are inversely related. Percent under 21, you see a life satisfaction effect, not so much a loneliness effect. So a few other categories of explanations. So urbanity, when we looked at things like population density, we see a pretty whopping big positive effect for loneliness, not so much for life satisfaction. Interestingly, the percent walk to work has a detrimental effect for feelings of loneliness and for life satisfaction once you've adjusted for loneliness. I'll come back to that in a moment. Religiosity, in this particular sample, we did not see that where you live makes a difference in terms of feelings of loneliness and life satisfaction in this sample. So here's the plots of these. So loneliness and life satisfaction with percent walk to work, population density. Income, home value. Interestingly, didn't matter what the state level of these variables were. It didn't seem to be associated with these feelings of loneliness and life satisfaction aggregated among these older adults. Social policy, similar non-effects, in raw correlations at least. Health, life expectancy, inversely with loneliness, positively with life satisfaction. Again, kind of what you'd expect. Is that a matter of people realizing that they are in a healthy neighborhood and that provides some confidence and security? Similar argument might be made for crime. We're talking about sense of control. People don't have much control over whether other people are, whether there are criminals in their neighborhood. Perhaps they don't have an option to leave. That could definitely create a sense of insecurity that could foster feelings of loneliness and decrease life satisfaction. I'm going to fly through this. So a couple of things to add. What have we learned from this? We have a phenomenon. There's a small amount of total variance accounted for by state level variance. Doesn't mean state level is not important. We're going to have to discuss how that plays out. Loneliness and life satisfaction are robustly inversely correlated. Aggregate measures correlate meaningfully with these state level predictors. Maybe some pathways. We're talking about life satisfaction. If you live in a state with a high percent of married individuals, loneliness is lower, life satisfaction is higher, but only until you account for lower levels of loneliness, then there is no life satisfaction effect. Same kind of thing happens for a murder rate. Maybe more interesting are some of the questions that come up. We have a unique sample in that we have only older adults. What is different about how older adults experience this context than younger adults experiencing the same context? I don't know, but it seems to be a valid question for the kind of work we're doing. Another question that came up, life satisfaction of older adults is higher in states that have a higher percentage of people under 21. Kind of counterintuitive for us because we know that life satisfaction generally diminishes somewhat with early in life, but it really increases later in life. So just by age effect alone, you'd expect the population levels to for it to be contagious, that you'd have high happiness spreading throughout. But the question then is, do older adults fare better in a younger than an older state? Is it because there's more contact with those younger people? That could cut both ways, something that we could open to question. Loneliness of older adults is higher in states with a higher percentage of living alone. Again, at an individual level, that's not typically found. Why is it found at the state level? then again, why is it found only until you account for life satisfaction? Is it a matter of choice, whether you are in this place living alone? And some additional questions that just popped out when I was listening to, and they started getting too long. So I will just throw those up because these are the things that came out of the speakers that have spoken already today. Can we think about states as nodes within a country, and to what extent is there an influence when people move, let's say, and you're comparing yourself to where you lived before? Or are there factors at an individual that predict how successful you will be in this move? And then just context as outcome. As policy, I'm imagining you would have all thought about this, but for me this is a new way of thinking about policy implications, that the context isn't just shaping us, but context is something we shape, and it comes from the bottom up and the top down. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Shigehiro Oishi, and his paper is entitled The Psychological Imagination of Residential Mobility. So welcome, Shige, from the University of Virginia.
Okay, thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me, more importantly. Okay, so today I will talk about psychological imagination of residential mobility. But first, let me start with Durkheim's famous distinction between sociology and psychology, as I'm one of the few psychologists. He said back in 1897, sociological method, as we practice it, rests wholly on the basic principle that social facts must be studied as things, that is, as realities external to the individuals. If no reality exists outside of individual consciousness, sociology wholly lacks any material of its own. In that case, the only possible subject of observation is the mental state of the individual, since nothing else exists. That, however, is the field of psychology. So interesting, back in 1897, there wasn't really huge field of psychology. Still, he mentioned it, so I'm sort of feel like complimented. But nevertheless, when I became interested in residential mobility from culture and well-being perspective, I did some study and quickly realized the Chicago School of Disorganization, and also encounter Rob Sampson's work. And this graph, everybody seems to have this one, so I don't have to say this, but last 10, 15 years, of course, there is a collective efficacy as a psychological mechanism, collective force that translate residential mobility into crime. And as a first step, because most of the sociological work at the time that I was aware of were concerned with mostly antisocial behaviors, and my advisor at Dina is a happiness researcher, and I tend to do happy stuff. So initially, I wanted to do residential mobility and stability in the context of pro-community action. My first academic job was at the University of Minnesota. And I realized that a colleague of mine, Alex Rothman, had this license plate, critical habitat license plate. And I asked him what it is, and he said, well, you can pay $30 more every year, and you can get this license plate, and that goes directly to the preservation of natural habitat in the state of Minnesota. So I thought, wow, this is a great behavioral indicator of pro-community action. So I immediately emailed DMV, and can I get the list of people who bought this? And of course they say, no, I'm not gonna use for private, stuff. And I negotiated and negotiated and negotiated. And finally, she said, $500 processing fee. So it's kind of bribe, but anyway, I paid $500 and I got this amazing list, street address of over 55,000 people who live Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the surrounding counties who purchased this. And from the street address, we were able to get 152 zip code area, and we chose to do use this as a unit of analysis because the census has the number of vehicles registered in the zip code area. Therefore, we were able to calculate the percentage of the car in each zip code area with the critical habitats. And then we can, of course, get the census residential mobility, median incomes. We also got the political donation to Republican Party and Democratic Party to control for those issues as well. And the analysis is simple correlation, right? Very simple. As we expected, the residential mobility of the zip code area was negatively correlated with the proportion of the car with critical habitats. But as you might expect, the median income is highly correlated with the proportion of the car with critical habitats. So we control for that, and still we found the significant association between residential mobility and the critical habitat license. In the paper we published, we also statistically control for the political donation rate in each zip code area, as well as other variables, and still this relationship holds. Okay. We were excited about that, but at the same time, I thought, well, what else can we look at? And I'm a big baseball fan, so I thought, well, maybe home game attendance could be construed as a pro-community action. I'm sure the anti-sports fan will disagree with me. But if you're a fan, you're miserable when your team is doing horrible, but yet you show up, then that's a pro-community action in my mind. Right. Always there is next year. So the link between performance and attendance, so we look at this, the whole season of Major League Baseball. Each home game, coming into the game, what's the winning percentage? And then what was the attendance? And then you can see the association between the performance and the home game attendance. And we predicted that in residentially stable neighborhood, perhaps there is no correlation, namely that home game attendance is not contingent upon performance, whereas in the residentially mobile place, such as Atlanta, Houston, and so forth, maybe it's much more contingent. They show up when team is winning, and when team is not doing well, it becomes like this. So that's what we did, and then we checked 28 Major League Baseball, and Arizona looked like this, Arizona Diamondbacks, Phoenix, so 0.29 correlation. They show up when team is doing well. Atlanta, even more, 0.37. On the other hand, you look at the Phillies, it's a negative correlation. They show up more when they're losing. Pittsburgh, the same way. So here is what you see, conditional community support in unstable, residentially mobile place, and you see this unconditional support in residentially stable place. And this is a summary. So you can see y-axis is the correlation coefficients between the performance, winning percentage, and attendance. And how do I use this one? Well, and you see, whoops. So correlation between the correlation is 0.41. The higher the residential mobility, the higher the association. So Atlanta, Denver, Arizona, Houston, Miami, you see huge contingent conditional support. Place like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Chicago, Cubs, yeah, negative contingency. So we found the support. In the real paper, we used the HLM, multi-level modeling. So we control for weekday, weekend effect, as well as population size, median incomes, and so forth, and this relationship holds. I'm from Japan, so I thought, well, I should look at the Japanese baseball, and we replicated the findings, residential mobility, and the within-team correlation that is highly contingent. My hometown, Fukuoka, happened to be most residentially mobile major city, and much more conditional, and maybe that's why I left Fukuoka, and I'm here now. All right, so these studies are nice. We're excited about these findings, but at the same time, very much like most of the sociological data, these are correlational data. So we also wanted to do some experiment to get at some of the causal mechanism of the residential stability on the pro-community action, as well as much more psychological mechanism of whether sense of belongings and so forth might mediate and explain this causal effect. So what we did is classic group experiment. So constructed stable versus unstable group, randomly assigned participants into one of these. Those participants were randomly assigned into stable condition, did the discussion task, and then the point allocation task 1, 2, and the final trivial pursuit task together, stable. On the other hand, those participants were randomly assigned into unstable mobile condition. After each task, we break down the group and created a new group, and then they had to do it again and again after each task. Okay? I included the Confederate research assistant in each group, okay, who played either likable person or unlikable person. And critically, in the last task, trivial pursuit task, we said, okay, whoever answered most will get the free, the $20 Amazon gift card. So it was self-interest for them not to help others and then concentrate on them. Confederate was trained to be stupid, so they say, what the hell is this question? And then we videotape this interaction and count how many times actually the other people help, as well as help each other. Okay. So we had two dependent variables, the actual helping of the Confederate as well as actual helping of each other. Okay. So this is the data on helping of the Confederate, and we found the causal effect of residential stability. Those who are randomly assigned into stable community, micro-community, indeed help Confederates significantly more than those who are randomly assigned into mobile group. Furthermore, this was partially mediated by psychological sense of belonging to the group. The data for helping of other groups are exactly same, a little bit stronger actually. So here there was the causal effect of residential stability on the helping each other, and this was mediated by sense of belonging. Okay. I was really proud of this work. Back in 2007, we published this, and the Columbia University invited me to give a colloquium, and Walter Mischel invited me, so I was excited. I gave this talk. At the end of the talk, Walter Mischel raised his hand, and he said, "This is interesting, but where is psychology?" So he thought this work was completely sociological. There is no psychology. And he thought I was reading too many Rob Sampsons and the sociologists, essentially. So I thought, as a young psychologist, that's not good, right? I just got the tenure at that time, but still I want to remain in psychology. So I thought hard about what might be the psychological, this mental state that are evoked by residential mobility. The one thing I can think of is that when you think about move, right, it's exciting. You start a new job, new school, but at the same time, it's tremendously anxious, distressed, uncertain thing. So I think we know a lot about this uncertainty and psychological distress. Usually, when we are distressed, we would like to hug familiar object, right? Familiarity seeking is, I think, a natural response to residentially mobile condition. After all, kids who are put in a strange situation, they tend to hug teddy bear. Academics who go to conference in an unknown city, they flock to Starbucks and hang on to Starbucks and a familiar object, even though I go to local coffee shop every day. So I thought, well, this is an interesting psychological mechanism and even has a sociological implication, maybe to the extent that the residential mobility evoke this sense of familiarity, seeking, and liking, that provide a huge advantage for the market for national chain stores. So there might be a link between the residential mobility and the dominance of national chain store. And if that's the case, then that might be the reason why in America, right, where people like to be unique, create this completely uniform, homogeneous suburbs and physical landscape, right, with the Targets and Walmarts and so forth. Every single mall you go, exactly the same stores, which is very strange. But anyway, to the extent that the landscape built environment tend to be uniform in a residentially mobile area, this will encourage and make it easier for people to move to new city. After all, the suburb of Chicago looks just like suburb of Boston, right? No? I don't know. But that might be the case. So that's the hypothesis. So how did I test this? Initially, I tested with undergraduate. That's what we do. So we invited undergraduate of University of Virginia come to my lab, randomly assigned into mobility, stability, and control condition. In a mobility condition, we asked them to imagine right after the graduation, they got the dream job. But this job requires them to move to a new city every other year. What kind of life they would be leading? In a stability condition, we say, well, you got the ideal job, but this job requires you to stay in the same place for at least 10 years. What kind of life you would be leading? And then the control condition, they wrote the typical day. And then we did the traditional mere exposure effect, which is the presentation of the Chinese character. Some Chinese character they saw once, some Chinese character they saw 3 times, some Chinese character they saw 9 times. And it's like this. They're sitting in front of a computer, and then they see these Chinese characters. Some many times, some only once. And actually, this is my name. Well, in real experiment, I didn't use my name, but just a presentation. Okay, so fill out task for 20 minutes or so, and then at the test phase, we include the new Chinese character they hadn't seen, as well as familiar Chinese character. Then I ask, how much do you like this? Okay, 1 to 7 point scale, 4 being essentially neither like or dislike. This is my sister's Chinese character. The noble one, no conditional variation, okay? However, the familiar Chinese character, this is Shige, they like it more. Okay? This is a replication of the Bob Zion's mere exposure effect, but this familiarity liking effect is statistically significantly enhanced in the mobility condition. Just the thought of mobility increased this liking of familiar object. Some of you might not care about Chinese character, so in the next experiment, we change to the face. Some face appear many times, some face never appear. And then we replicated this finding. Furthermore, we were able to explain this residential mobility effect from anxiety. Essentially, mobility evoke more anxiety. They use more anxiety-related words. Then the number of the anxiety-related words they used predict the strength of familiarity liking. And once you include the anxiety, then the direct effect of mobility on familiarity liking disappears. Okay. So we thought this is pretty nice, but I thought I need to use some sociological imagination. So we asked this question, are there more chain stores indeed in the mobile state? We looked at the 21 different kinds of chain stores, and we did the meta-analysis, and the answer is yes. There are more chain stores in the mobile place, such as Nevada and Arizona, than Pennsylvania, essentially. And we also asked this question of, do national chain stores actually do better sales-wise in the residential mobile area, the stable area? And the target data shows that the sales per capita in target was higher in the mobile states than stable states, controlling for the median incomes and the number of target stores in each state. Okay, so finally, so that was one line of research. Okay, in 1 minute, I will finish this social relationships. I was supposed to talk about this today. So residential mobility evokes this anxiety. What's going to happen to my friends? I'm going to lose my friends and so forth. And that should give rise to the broader network. So try to do the diversification in your social network in the volatile, essentially, market. So that's the idea. And then we have network size information from state of Virginia, state of Minnesota, and Tokyo, and certainly it's correlated with residential mobility. And in the lab experiment, we again provoked randomly assigned people into mobility, stability, control condition, and asked about the motivation to expand social network. And there is a significant effect again. And this one was explained by the anticipated level of loneliness. All right. And the final study is there any function of having a broad social network? So we did the computer simulation, the agent-based modeling, and essentially Mark Granovity is right. There is a strength of weak tie in the various level of residential mobility as well as a crisis probability, the chance of you needing a major help. Only time, deep social tie, having deep social tie, narrow social tie is advantageous is when you live in a residentially stable and also poor neighborhood. Okay, so that's the computer simulation, but computer simulation is computer simulation, so we wanted to get the real data, so we surveyed American adults and essentially replicated the finding in terms of here, dependent variables, life satisfaction, positive affects, and so forth, and pattern is same. Essentially, high residential mobility, high income, high residential mobility, low income, and residentially stable but rich neighborhood, having a broad, shallow network, people are happier. However, this is American, but those who live in a residentially stable and poor neighborhood, it was much better off to have deep, narrow tie. So certainly the social network strategy is different depending on your social context, but the functionality and adaptability of social network is different. All right, so just very quick summary. Using the social psychological imagination, we are able to show residential mobility evokes conditional identification that give rise to less pro-social, pro-community action, anxiety giving rise to the familiarity seeking, loneliness giving rise to the expansion of social network. And we haven't done this, but certainly residential mobility evokes uncertainty, and there's a great deal of work in psychology that links to the holding of extreme ideology to reduce uncertainty, so that might be the case. Moving is depleting, very tiring, and there's a huge literature on the ego depletion linking with the lack of social control. So we haven't examined these two, but there might be linkage like that. So I think it's important to use sociological as well as psychological imagination, and small science, the lab experiment might help the big science in some way. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, this is my address.
Thank you. We'll now hand things over to Ken Frank from Michigan State University, who will draw all these papers together. Thank you, Ken.
I can use the one that we put on this.
Oh, you can, okay, great.
Thanks. Well, so it's been an exciting day for me, so thank you for inviting me. Lots of ideas going on in my head. In the morning, I tweaked the slides a little bit to comment on some of what happened there, as well as the papers that you saw here. So I like the three papers a lot. It's actually, sometimes the challenge is always to figure out how they go together, but I think in this case, although they're at different levels of analysis, I'll talk about that, they have the potential to talk to each other. So I'll just walk you through that, and I'm going to put a little of my own spin on it. I think I'll take the discussant's prerogative. And so if we just look at them together, thinking in terms of levels of analysis, which is how I organized it, I have a background in that area. At the state level, you have the Hawkley paper, which is finding loneliness is negatively associated with life satisfaction. Loneliness is related to marriage and urbanicity. Satisfaction related to percent divorced and youth, percent under 21, and walking to work. I think I've got all those right in there. The Oishi paper is more, did I say that, Oishi? Is that Oishi? It has this interesting argument about the psychological imagination, And he's, you know, the array of results that you just saw is really, to me, quite breathtaking, but then ultimately at the end, burrowing down to sort of an individual phenomenon about what is this individual thinking, processing, sense-making, as they engage in mobility or potential mobility, with the finding that the thought of moving creates anxiety, which then provokes the need for familiarity, is one of the interesting findings that you know, anxiety is sort of mediating this effect. And that gets you all concerned about future relationships, anticipating future relationships, that sort of thing. So at a very micro level, ultimately, in that paper. And then the Browning and Cagney paper you have, we're at a sort of a meso level. Where you have people within neighborhoods, which is where we were in the morning, a little bit more, although moving back and forth. So I'm just kind of organizing the results and taking you into how I'm thinking of them in terms of levels, and then that will be part of the basis of the commentary and critique. So as I think about these operating at different levels, then the question to me becomes, how do the different levels relate to each other? You know, how does something going on at a very high level, and I'm taking the state here as an example of a very broad social institution. So we could think about other institutions beside a state, but you can think of the state. How does that interact with the neighborhood level, and then how does that interact with the individual level? And so I've got this little diagram here. See, I didn't ride around and get real pictures, so I jumped onto clip art and popped a few things in. It's much quicker. You should try that, Rob. You know, God, I could have saved you like 10 years. You know. All right. So anyway, the idea here is that as I think about the state or a large institution, large-scale institution, that institution has the capacity to affect the venues in which people will interact. So here you are, you're in this neighborhood, but the streets in that neighborhood, the parks in that neighborhood, the Starbucks in that neighborhood, all might have been affected by the large-scale institutions that have, in some ways, I want to say determined, but influenced the infrastructure and various things you have in that neighborhood. So that's by way of saying that a lot of times in various policy research, we look for ways to affect action directly, and I don't know that those ways are there. But there are ways to affect it indirectly by affecting the venues in which people might convene, and maybe more accurately, constricting the venues in which they won't convene. If there's no Starbucks, if there's no auto dealership or whatever, because of various actions of the state, then people won't convene at that Starbucks. So it's a constraining factor. So that's the way the state, that I see it, can affect what's going on in the neighborhood processes. Now at the neighborhood level, you have individuals nonetheless choose to interact in these processes, in these venues. So you have individuals making choices. Okay, there's a block party, or there's your Starbucks, or there's the chain store, whatever it happens to be. Individuals make choices. And as they make these choices, they create, if you will, network experiences, or a local cultural context, or I have another word I'm going to use for this in a moment. So the idea here is you have some constraint imposed by the external structures, and you have some individual agency, and it's when those things come together in the meso level that you get this neighborhood phenomenon. So I'm trying to bring together the findings from the different papers through these different levels. All right, a little bit of my own spin, because I'm going to expand on this neighborhood phenomenon a little bit. This is what a school looks like to me. So you guys see buildings and lockers and teachers, and what I see is students and the courses they take. What you're looking at is a two-mode clustering of transcript data, high school transcripts from Ad Health. It's just one Ad Health school. We did the same thing in 78 Ad Health schools. And what you see are clusters here. A red dot really is one person, but it represents 6 or 7 people. And these squares represent particular courses that people take. As a point of interest, what I have down here is a group of people who are organized around baking and art. They take these 2 unusual classes that really set them off from everybody else. And so as such, there's a lot you can glean from this in educational research if I take you inside of a school. So I'll make a few points, and then we'll apply them to the neighborhood context. So within the school, what we argue is that this set of activities, for example, baking and art, can contribute to an identity. And as it contributes to identity, I think that can key into a lot of the other psychological factors that you're talking about. As people move, then they might change identities. And that can be psychologically constraining or something like that. Second point to be made from this is that this is an emergent phenomenon. Typically, when people go into schools, they say, oh, jocks, nerds, burnouts, geeks, you know, which are the same categories for the last 50 years and in every school. Do you really believe that's how every school is organized? No. You go into the South, and you're going to find agricultural engineering, you know, big time or something like that. You might find a military group over here. So these are emergent phenomenon. And so we'll find the same thing. I'm going to make the same argument that can happen in a neighborhood. Last point that I'll make here is that these are non-overlapping groups in the sense, but you can participate in activities outside of your group. Totally fair. Go over and take another course over there, but you have a certain set of activities that define sort of your group and set you off from other people. So this is a picture of a school, but I want you to think about how it would apply if you were to expand outside the school into the neighborhood. So you have a group of people who, let's say they all go to the same grocery store, the same place of worship, and and their kids play lacrosse together, whatever it happens to be. All right, so now that little group of people is seeing each other in 3 different places, and they can start to form an identity as a group. They're engaging in common transitions between the events. So maybe I'll give you a ride tomorrow. I'll give your kid a ride from the lacrosse thing to whatever, the grocery store, whatever it happens to be. And so as they participate in these events, they can start to build up interactions that can then shape their, if you will, intra-neighborhood experience. And so with this, I would go to David's ideas of the more localized context. It isn't school writ large in this context. It's local positions, as we call them, within the school. And in the neighborhood, I would say, is it the neighborhood writ large, or is it a more localized phenomenon in the neighborhood? All right. So I kind of made a bunch of these points as I was talking about it. I want to just underline here that I would say that it suggests that there might be no single monochrome neighborhood experience, that you have this cultural heterogeneity, if I am using the concept correctly here. So I can talk, I think I can go over past some of these other things. The last point that I'll make is with respect to that picture. Oh, sorry. Last point I'll make with respect to that picture is these, once you have an identity group, these can be very influential people. They're people you're exposed to toward Chris's point of the exposure argument. You might not be friends with them yet, but you're sure seeing a lot of them, and you know how they dress. You know how they act in a particular public setting, and all sorts of things that can become quite influential. In a sense, they're the people on the street corner who keep being on the same street corners you go to. All right, so this way of thinking, a couple of points that I made there, the levels of thinking and thinking about clusters of people who participate in similar events, suggests something of, it gives a line for critique for some of the papers, so I just want to engage the papers again. One thing, as we work at the state level, you have to work really, really hard to stay away from that ecological fallacy. You know, is it the people who are married who are less lonely, or is it the people who are encountering people who are not married who are less lonely, or something like that? That's just one example. And so what I'm thinking about here is that I want to take you into the activities you participate in your neighborhood, and who do you encounter there? How has the state affected that? And you really get into the mind then of how the person reacts. And Louise and I were talking about this at lunch. Let's say you're over 21, but you go into a neighborhood with a bunch of young people. You know, okay, so how does that affect your response, your sense of loneliness, or whatever it happens to be? And I think a lot of this is going to translate down to spillover effects, that one person or a group of people in your neighborhood participated in something, they got some, quote, treatment, or whatever it happens to be. But then they kind of bring it back to the neighborhood, and through this exposure, through participating in events with them, you kind of get an indirect effect. In educational research, we're starting to think about that an awful lot. Okay, so taking it into the psychological imagination paper by Oishi, it's one of the things I would want to push on is to really get you into the steps, the shoes of the individual who's moving. Okay, so I'm going to move. And we know this provokes anxiety. And that anxiety can make me seek familiar things. So what am I going to do about it? I show up. Oh, one answer is I'm going to go to the Starbucks, the chain stores, to make me feel more comfortable. Another answer is, though, I'm going to pick my venues in the neighborhood that, you know, I'm going to say, oh, I got my kid involved in soccer or whatever it happens to be. And as I choose those venues, that's going to take me into a certain location within the neighborhood that will then affect other individual characteristics of myself, other behaviors. So, and then I guess the last thing I would say to the Browning paper is to ask, why are the people choosing the activities they are choosing? Let's make that, you know, what's going on? You know, one answer is, well, I'm seeking to reduce my anxiety if I seek the chain stores, but I don't think we have a lot of answers there. About, did I just happen to wind up? What is it about the neighborhood that facilitated me going from here to here to here that, that really then put me in a certain position within my neighborhood? So to really problematize that issue. And then I guess a measurement issue is, do we know the levels of exposure? So I showed up at these places. Really, how much did I take in? Did I show up at the same time as other people? And you know, we know their locations. Do we know the times? And then I would also suggest to pay attention to the transitions between activities as I drove by from one to the other. Oh yeah, I passed that grocery store you passed. One more thing in common. All right, so I don't know how I'm doing on time. What do I have? Done. Sorry. All right. I didn't see the one, I saw the clock. Oh,
So we initially had a little delay in our catering, so I'd like to go until 3 o'clock. That's okay, and then we'll take our break. So we have about 10 minutes for questions of our set of speakers. And Louise, I invite you as well to join the group.
Yeah, a couple of comments. I found all the 3 papers very, very interesting and very imaginative. And I would like to compliment you on your efforts. I have 2 suggestions. One is to Ken, the discussant, actually, that some of the work that, or the role that some of these affiliations might play in terms of developing identity and becoming the basis for social networks. My colleague at Arizona, Ron Breiger, has introduced this notion of cultural whole. And also one of our former students, Omar Lazardo at Notre Dame, has talked about the importance of these affiliations in the creation of network ties. And so you might want to take a look at them. But my second comment, and it's more of a question, is to Chris. When I did the calculations of the 2,475 households over 65 tracts, I think it comes out to about 38 people per track.
About 40.
Yeah, about 40. And I collected similar data in Phoenix metropolitan area on what kids did on Saturday, and it's a sample across 114 zip codes. And what we did, or finally decided to do, is instead of creating our affiliation by individuals by venues, the idea would be to aggregate your respondents into different categories. So for example, like black, white, Hispanic, or low income, middle income, high income. And then you might want to explore the possibilities of doing, using methodology like correspondence analysis, which would actually enable you to visually inspect the relative proximities of these different market segments to the different venues. So those are 2 suggestions, and I would like to hear your comments on the problem of using this kind of survey data over so many units of analysis.
Well, I would be interested in why you chose not to go with the affiliation approach. One, Right, okay, but not yet, not with the, so, one major issue with, and, this may, I don't know how relevant this is, but, a key problem with 40 households in a tract is that, essentially what you're doing is proxying the co-location network. It's a sample, and there is the true underlying co-location network and how close you're going to get with the, with 40 households and a subset of activities. So it's clear that we are getting a crude representation of that co-location network with the LA fans data. That said, we think that we get meaningful variation in the properties of those co-location networks. So we think that we're potentially on to something, though. Now, what we're doing in addition to this is trying to understand, we have some simulation studies in the works. In other words, simulate the actual co-location network and then sample from that and see how much error and in what ways, based on certain features of the network of interest, you are misrepresenting that at lower levels. So that's an area of development.
This is just small, about Toronto. I didn't see that Toronto was on your list because it's in Canada, right? It's only US. But you would find probably in Toronto conditionality, and it's very high residential mobility when it comes to baseball, but hockey is a different story. I mean, they could, the Leafs could lose, they do lose every single game, and people will come no matter what. So there's differences there, even within a city. But I just wanted to sort of express, I was just sort of struck by a difference across these presentations and maybe with some of the earlier ones. The Jane Jacobs versus this sort of anxiety accruing to moving difference was what struck me. If you think about the Jane Jacobs perspective, it was a sort of, it always would valorize being exposed to all sorts of differences. That's the great thing about living in a big city for Jacobs, right? You see it, you encounter people you wouldn't normally encounter, and it forces you out of yourself somehow, and she thinks it has these great things that come from that. And that also is anxiety generating, but she would have said that's a valuable kind of anxiety, right? So we have one sort of perspective where the anxiety is something that's sort of terrifying and people do things to minimize it, and another perspective where it's somehow exhilarating or a sign of cosmopolitan liberal openness. So I don't know how, so I was just struck by the difference and if there's a way to put those together somehow, or if they're just opposites.
Maybe it's because Jane Jacobs lived in the village, so for 50 years.
Then she moved to Toronto.
So it was a mix of stability within a cosmopolitan environment.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe there was an actual mix.
The way
I think the New York is surprisingly residentially stable and neighborhoody. So.
Right. I mean, I think that the diversity element of the Jacobs model, she places a lot of emphasis on that, in part because of the ecological consequences of having lots of different things to do in a neighborhood. That brings people out at different times of day, crisscrossing in all sorts of different directions. That gives a rich ecology. But she's also emphasizing the stability of that ecology over time. So it is a mix.
There's a kind of fusion of it,
I would just want to touch on that idea of stability. I think is really interesting. In your lab experiment, it seemed you were trying to operationalize the idea of personal mobility. I'm going to move to another city after college, and I don't know what it's going to be like, and then I'm going to move again and again and again. Whereas in the other experiment, when you created the groups changed. So you weren't moving into your entire community was changing, and all of the ties between the other members of the community is changing. So I was wondering, how do you think about mobility in a mobile community versus the effects of personal mobility into a community that is stable besides you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And South and Haney, I think, has the great paper about the residential mobility and the school level mobility. And those students who moved to a mobile school did so much better than the mobile the new transfer student to the stable school. So, of course, Patrick and Rob Sampson have the destination effect paper. So certainly there's a destination effect, not just a mobility, but moving to where. Certainly that matters. And I haven't done any experimental work on that, but I think that's important, obviously.
Okay, so it works. So first of all, extremely interesting papers all around. The papers, particularly the discussion of the word emergence, which came up multiple times over the course of the panels, made me think a lot about University of Chicago sociologist James Coleman, who for a long time was actually very concerned with emergence, particularly the extent to which interactions between individuals, which resulted in part on the basis of their aims of fulfilling their rational needs, produce larger institutions. So I have a question for Chris and a question for Shige along these lines. The question for Chris has to do with how we conceive the relationship between the activity itself, the social interaction, and these spaces. One could, if I'm getting this correctly, the idea is that the spaces where people interact are essentially exogenous. And people are interacting in those spaces and generating patterns that are going to have some impact on their well-being because in part of the fact that these spaces provide an opportunity for them to interact. One might imagine a scenario in which people's decisions to interact with others would have some impact on the presence of spaces and how many there are and where they're located. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that aspect of the process. It cannot simply be the case. In fact, if I'm reading Shige's points correctly, the point about the fascinating findings about target stores and so on make clear that individual motivations have some impact, or suggest that individual motivations have some impact on the location of, well, in that case, shopping spaces, but presumably other kinds of organizations. So I'm wondering if you had any insights on that. And in Shige's case, the question was maybe a different angle into the same issue. This was a case in which, if we go back to one interpretation of Coleman, individuals interact, and their interactions ultimately result in institutions and organizations. In this case, I'm thinking of the hugging Starbucks and the other entities. We didn't need the interaction part. It's just people's need for security, and they're moving around produced Starbucks and Target and so on. I'm wondering if you think, in general, the interactional aspect of it isn't really necessary for the location of institutions and organizations, or if there's a part of your work that actually looks at that interactional aspect.
Well, I think, of course, it's a critical point as to what, and Ken was making this point as well, how do people get to these locations to begin with? And, can we sort out the process of selection into the locations from, the other influences we're trying to identify here? So obviously we want to have longitudinal data on this. We want to see how communities at one point in time influence outcomes at a later point. That would clearly be a way to go with this. One of the problems, of course, with this analysis is that places that have a lot of interaction, if the networks are strong in the community, they're going to share information about where to go. So at this point, the analysis can't cross-sectionally deal with some of those issues. Although I suppose you could make an argument that some of the centralization mechanism, you might see more centralization occurring or a greater impact of centralization if selection was at play, or if this process of sharing information was at play. I could make that argument, but I probably wouldn't strongly. So I think we just need to move to longitudinal data to be able to see how these processes play out. But you could also take the extreme case. People don't have complete control over where they go. There are spatial dynamics at play. Distance matters. And if we think about the extreme case of a highly concentrated poverty community that's effectively deinstitutionalized, people don't have places to go within the community that would lead to this kind of interaction. People are stepping outside, and some of this pilot data suggests that in the low-income communities, people are traveling further to go to places, suggesting that they don't have options that they want to take advantage of within their community, leading to lower likelihood of ties. So.
In terms of other organizations or institutions, we looked at the megachurch, and the megachurch is really successful, and there are a lot more megachurches in the residentially mobile state than residentially stable state, which I assume because there's a lower threshold. You can just join and then leave easy, meet and get some useful information there in the megachurch. So we did the lab experiment component of that, and essentially that's what we are finding. When people think about mobile transient life, then they like to join this low commitment, easy exit type groups. So there's an interesting thing. But in terms of the intermediate level of interactions and emergent property, I think in terms of target stores and things like that, there seems to be nothing there. Although when Virginia gave me an offer, I asked 2 questions. Does Charlottesville have Whole Foods, and does Charlottesville have Target? So I did go through interpersonal process there.
I was actually just slipped a note that I'm to hold you for about 5 more minutes. So let's keep the questions coming.
I'm just going to give a quick comment on Chris, and given the morning, you know, these phenomena are emergent, right? People, I've argued, you know, are choosing to participate in these various venues, and yet there's a stability to the neighborhood phenomenon. Oh, they're emergent, and yet there's a stability to the neighborhood structures or phenomenon over time, or at least there's some sense of that. So it's a very interesting question that I've been trying to wrestle with about how that stability is there. I mean, do people come in and copy other people's patterns of participation? Why would they do that? You know, and how does that happen? I don't know. That are shaping it, yeah.
If I might, and I wanted you to draw out a little bit more about why loneliness, or you could conceptualize it as a state-level phenomenon, because I think of these things, and it mimight be my own orientation as sort of micro-level processes, might be more variation within states than between. Is it an urban density phenomenon? I wanted you to expand on that a bit, if you could.
Well, I definitely do think there would be more variation within than among. My perspective is still very heavily psychologically dominated, so I'm listening very closely to what you folks are saying. The notion of contagion, a well-established phenomenon. If you're exposed to people who are lonely, that spreads. Just like attitudes spread, like behaviors are, in a sense, contagious. Loneliness does spread, and the explanation is pretty much interactional. If you interact with someone who is lonely, there is a social cognitive style they possess, especially as time goes on, where they are going to be kind of defensive in their interactions in an attempt to protect themselves from potential rejection. They're reaching out. This is what loneliness does. It's very adaptive. It gets you reaching out, trying to make connections, but you behave in a way that fosters self-defeating behavior. And people pick up on that. You might not be conscious of it, but you detect that, and you will be cautious in return. Your interactions become less disclosing, less trusting, and next thing you know, you're interacting a little more cautiously with the person you're talking to, and there's a reasonable explanatory mechanism for that. So I can imagine within a state you're going to see variance, but you can see this clustering. As it starts spreading, you can see it's going to create nodes.
I have, in a way, a simple question growing out of looking at neighborhood dynamics and starting with the observation that many neighborhood dynamics, especially in, say, an ethnically conscious city like Chicago, assume that people want to live with others like themselves, and they hate or dislike or they avoid people of different background and so forth. What we're seeing increasingly is that that's no longer the case. So that is, there are some neighborhoods like that, but there are other neighborhoods that are the opposite, where people want to leave a boring, homogeneous suburban town, for instance, or they find some Big Ten college towns boring, so they come to Chicago on the weekend, so forth. Could one conceptualize this as maybe a fairly simple dimensional personality type, and this is maybe a more psychologically oriented question. Are there any studies in psychology that, I mean, I loved your path diagrams in particular, that would incorporate, because I don't think I saw it there specifically, differences in personality or culture and personality, scenes and personality, so it leads me in the same direction. But I mean, one could phrase it as a scene at a neighborhood or a psychological level, but you did it so elegantly at the psychological level, moving across these multiple data sets. Is there any way that people, or if you, for instance, if you had the big five in your data or some other psychological dimensions, would you expect some of those coefficients? So this relates in a sense to Chris's model of Jane Jacobs favoring the cosmopolitan versus the I want to be in my Marquette Park where there are no people of a different ethnic group than mine. And that certainly is, if we just frame personality in the simple terms of I want to be with people just like me versus I'm challenged by others who are very different, how much would that transform a lot of our dynamics and models, especially of local effects?
So there is one good paper.
Has anybody systematized that, is my question,
so,
or how to model that coherently? Because we've looked and we haven't found.
So Marcus Jokla did this study in a huge Finnish study looking at the temperament, and essentially the rural area residents of extroverts tend to move to new urban city, much more likely than introverts, essentially. So he looked at the Midas data and found that extroversions and openness to experience, as you might expect, predict the mobility across within the state also. So using the framework of Big Five in general, there are a couple of people, personality psychologists, who are doing selection sort of process work. And I think I cited that paper in the conference paper too, but.
Okay, let's continue with those questions over dessert. And why don't we return? Great, thank you very much. Great set of papers. And let's try to return to the room about 3.